Don't hurt the next generation, for goodness sake.
President Buhari raises concern or lingering ASUU strike in some state governments.
APC clears air over alleged displeasure. Choice of Kashim Shettima as Tinubu's running mate.
NDLEA arrests one escapee from Kuje Custodial Center with hard drugs in Abuja.
And on Good Morning Nigeria today, we shall focus on whether it is time to restructure the electricity distribution companies.
The federal government last week Tuesday announced the restructuring of 5 out of 11 electricity distribution companies in Nigeria with a takeover by a new board or new boards. Those affected that of Port Harcourt, Kano, Kaduna, Ibadan, and Benin distribution companies.
The Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission and the Bureau of Public Enterprises disclosed that the move became necessary following the inability of the 5 discos to repay loans taken from Nigerian banks to acquire their assets during the 2013 privatization of the Nigerian Power Holding Company of Nigeria, which of course were broken into 7 generating companies and 11 distribution companies. The generation companies are known as GENCOs and the distribution companies are known as DISCOs.
Yeah, although the management of Benin Disco is threatening to resist the takeover, saying the bank held by the latest action on the distribution company. The Bureau of Public Enterprises explains there are strong indications of the dire financial situations of these discos amongst other inadequacies.
Well, the federal government maintains a 40% shareholding in the privately owned enterprises, that's to say the DISCOs, and that share ownership is being managed by the Bureau of Public Enterprises. But it is not the best of times for the DISCOs, as Nigeria's electricity sector has remained largely dysfunctional, with just below 4,000 megawatts generated and distribution even so poor amongst 200 million people and several businesses and industries.
Very serious inadequacy.
That's right, Kira.
All right. And stakeholders are always at loggerheads and notorious for passing the buck on as consumers grapple with exorbitant billings not commensurate with services rendered, as well as untold hardships on businesses and mass metering issues.
In fact, the National Grid, which is under the management of the Transmission Company of Nigeria, wholly owned by the federal government, in the 7 months of this year, has collapsed on a number of occasions. And just some weeks ago, power generation was said to have crashed from about 3,700 megawatts to an all-time low, even though the figure has been disputed. Some reported 9 megawatts, but the TCN said that exactly wasn't the case. But certainly, the power generation crashed to well below 3,000 megawatts. Now, there have been blackouts across the country, and of course the DISCOs have also attributed persistent poor supply to load shedding by the Transmission Company of Nigeria. Kieran?
Yeah, just passing the buck as we earlier highlighted. Well, Good Morning Nigeria has been monitoring events that continue to unfold in the power sector, and on the 23rd of June it assembled guests across board who said the endemic power situation is not about generation but distribution, despite the introduction of service-based tariff pegged on improved service delivery.
Now, the guests also said that intervention in the areas of multiple grids, gas generation, among others, will give hope to Nigerian electricity consumers. Now, the recent intervention of the government by way of ensuring that the takeover of the DISCOs by their creditors, we should stress that, is one that the industry will enable the industry to get back onto the right footing in order to bid ultimately farewell to challenges in the power sector. And of course, this is by turning around the fortunes of the alien companies whose shares were collateralized and now be taken over by their creditors. Kieran.
All right. So with the new challenges in the governance structure of the
changes, you would say, right?
Exactly. On the 5 discos, which has already been named, what are the critical issues in some of the processes to be deployed in ensuring a history transition from reform for an efficient service delivery? These and more will form part of our talking points as we discuss, of course, is it time to restructure the discos?
That's right. Yeah, the key point there, Kieran, about whether it is time or not to restructure the discos is what our guests also pointed out when we had a conversation on the power sector on the 23rd of June, as earlier mentioned. The point has also been made that the franchise areas of some of the discos are so large as to impede efficiency in the management of the areas. When it was NEPA, when it was PHCN, it was a different consideration, but some of the franchise areas are so extensive. I mean, when you look at AEDC, for instance, AEDC, which is Abuja, the FCT is growing, and you can imagine the level of power consumption. Now you hook onto that Nasarawa State. You also hook onto that Niger State, which has probably one of the largest landmass areas in the entire federation.
I think it's they don't have the capacity, to cover all those vast areas. Of course, infrastructure is also lacking. That's part of it. That's why we questioned earlier on in Good Morning Nigeria some time ago the capacity of these companies, and of course, did they really have the financial muscle ever before they bidded for? Join their bundling. All right, so that's part of it. That's what's playing out now.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're saying.
Yeah, you're right. There's no question about that.
All right, I am Kieran Umayo, welcoming you to this Tuesday's edition of Good Morning Nigeria, which is a public holiday to mark Eid Kabir.
And I'm Kingsley Sabalo. I join my colleague Kieran to also welcome you to the program. We are live on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. Now, in the course of the program, we have our usual supplementary segments at the appropriate time. Those will include newspaper review and perhaps business. For now, let's get the highlights of the morning news with Elizabeth Omori. Hello, Elizabeth.
Good morning, Kingsley and Kieran, and here is the morning news. President Muhammad Buhari may have lost patience over the prolonged industrial action by the Academic Staff Union of Universities in the country, saying enough is enough. The president expressed his anger while granting audience to members of the Progressive Governors Forum on Salah Homage at his Dara residence in Katsina State.
There's nothing wrong in showing the government and the leadership that you don't like what they are doing. But enough is enough. Don't hurt the next generation, for goodness sake. So those of you who have friends that are teachers, persuade them to go back to classes so that our children can resume their educational pursuit.
And the Progressive Governors Forum says its members are willing, able and ready to work assiduously towards ensuring that the governing APC records overwhelming victory in the next general elections in order to effectively retain power in the country. Chairman of the Forum and Governor of Kebbi State, Atiku Bagudu, stated this in Dara, Katsina State, while leading the members to pay Salah homage on President Muhammad Buhari. The APC governors described as false, baseless and mischievous insinuations in some quarters that the governors are not happy with the choice of Senator Kashim Shettima as running mate to the party's presidential candidate, Asiwaju Bola Tinubu.
And we believe he brings a lot of bad to the presidential ticket. So we are quite pleased. We have not met as governors for anyone to say governors are not happy. Maybe one governor is not happy or two individually, but I don't think there is anything like that.
Now, a bit on security and election. The Inspector General of Police, Usman Al-Khali Baba, has ordered the deployment of adequate police personnel, operational assets for the July 16 Ocean governorship election Force Public Relations Officer notes that the Deputy Inspector General of Police in charge of the Force Criminal Investigation Department, DIG Johnson Babatunde Kokumo, is to supervise and coordinate the security components of the election to ensure a peaceful environment that guarantees the security of law-abiding citizens as they perform their civic responsibilities. The IGP assures that the force will collaborate with the Independent National Electoral Commission and other stakeholders to protect democratic values, provide level playing field for all political actors, and ensure adequate protection of voters, INEC officials, equipment, accredited observers, and key players in Osun states. The increase in insecurity across some African countries has forced nations in the region to spend so much of their monies on security investments and less on development financing. This has become something to worry about for analysts and development experts in the region as they propose good governance and policies as the deliberate approach to cope with these challenges.
We have to now make a link between security, between growth, between security linked to investment, to growth and development. We can't look at security anymore as an exogenous factor in that development process. We've got to integrate it as an endogenous part of that.
And operatives of the National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, NDLEA, have arrested one of the wanted terror suspects who escaped from the Medium Security Correctional Center, Kuje, following an attack on the facility by insurgents last week in Abuja. The three terror suspect, Sulaiman CD, was arrested in the early hours of Monday at Irawan Motor Park in the Federal Capital Territory while attempting to board a commercial vehicle to Maiduguri, Borno State, with 3 wraps of cannabis sativa. While commending the officers and men of the FCT command of the agency for the arrest and vigilance, NDLEA boss Brigadier General Muhammad Buba Marwa has directed that the wanted suspect be immediately handed over to the Nigerian Correctional Service. Meanwhile, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, professors and academics must take keen interest in issues of education and health, exploring options for reform and innovation in those human capital development sectors. This was the highlight of a virtual meeting between Vice President Yemi Osinbajo and a team of professors drawn from the 6 geopolitical zones under the auspices of the Progressive Intellectuals Advisory Group. On health, the Vice President called on members of the group to support the federal government's efforts to reform the healthcare system by contributing ideas that will make health insurance work effectively in the country. Goods worth millions of naira have been lost in an early Monday morning inferno at Abuja market in Ibadan, Oyo State.
They just called us this morning, so we don't know how it happened. We don't even take a pin from all the goods in the shop. It's not 1 million, it's not 2 million.
My mom, who is an shop owner, has been admitted to the hospital since 8:30 when she heard about the incident. So I beg the government to please help us.
And that's the morning news. Good Morning Nigeria continues with Kieran and Kingsley after the break. To stay with us.
You're watching Good Morning Nigeria on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. Now let's ginger ourselves some more by hearing some good news about ginger on the global market. Let's join our correspondent, Aleka Opmanache Aruwa, for details.
A key driver of the global ginger market growth, according to Global Ginger Market Report 2021 to 2027, is increasing skin problems. Ginger powders are used in the cosmetic industry as adding fragrance in soaps and personal care products. Also, the ginger is used as a condiment or flavoring agent in salad dressings, tomato ketchup and sauces, pickles or curry dishes. According to Statista, a German-based international business intelligence platform, Nigeria was the main producer of ginger in Africa as of 2020. the country produced over 734,000 metric tons. In the said year, the firm noted that Africa produced slightly over 856,000 metric tons of ginger in total. Globally, Nigeria has the second largest production share of about 16% after India, with a production share of 33.9%. In 2016, it was 522,096 metric tons. With Business News, Alika Opanachi, Arua.
Thank you very much, Alika, for the good news about ginger on the global market. Now it's time for us to take a look at the headlines in some of today's newspapers.
And let's welcome Bayo Tebi, our newspaper reviewer. Bayo, good to see you.
Thank you, Kim. Good morning. Good morning, Kinsley. Good morning, Nigeria.
Good to see you. We have two papers, the Punch and the Sun. Let's begin with the Sun, I believe. The Sun newspaper, following headlines were taken from the front page. Kuje jailbreak. NDLEA arrests wanted terrorist suspect with drugs in Abuja. Police recaptures one inmate in Niger. 2 varsity students, 3 others drowned fleeing from Delta tank farm explosion. More knocks and kudos for APC over Muslim ticket. Senator resigns from support group. Senate President, APC Northeast Caucus hail Shetima's choice. Not good for secular state, says Clark. That's E.K. Clark. Arawa Christian group clash. Arawa Christian group clash. Buhari and governors meet in Daura, back choice. Details of those stories you can find on pages 6 and 27. Revive refineries, remove subsidy to stem corruption. Nasima tells federal government. 2023, Obi supporters develop mobile app for campaign and others. Obi supporters develop mobile app for campaign and others. Osun Guba, that's governorship election, gunmen attack LP candidates' residence. Strike, that's the kicker, enough is enough, Buhari tells ASU. Charges them to consider generational consequences of action.
All right, now to the Punch newspaper, and above the nameplate of the Punch, NNPC blocks Exxon Mobil's asset sale to Seplat. That's on page 24. Power generation drops. Disco's federal government battle for control. The story is captured on page 22 of the Punch newspaper. PDP power rotation too late now. Southeast should wait, according to Bafarawa. All right, that's on page 7. 41 million get names to escape SIM ban. It's on page 22. Directors of 10 banks pocket 6.96 billion naira allowance and compensation. For details, go to page 21 of the Punch. All right, Kinsley already has read the story on the meeting of the governors in Dara with the president. All right, now below the photo story on the Punch, we have ACF laments insecurity, asks Buhari to do more. That's on page 16. Bricklayer arraigned for filming woman's nude, demanding 20,000 naira. That's on page 5. Norge chairman paid 15 million naira for abducted wife and baby. It's on page 4. At the bottom of the Punch, police confirm 4 deaths in tank farm explosion. It's on page 5. SKP terror suspect fleeing FCT nabbed with cannabis. It's on page 4. Kuje, federal government threatens sanctions. Ghana alerts immigration personnel. That's on page 14. Let's begin by now.
Thank you. This is from Daura President Muhammad Buhari, who said the APC governors and leaders who went to Daura to pay him homage. He says in 10 months' time, he will retire to Daura and not Kaduna, where he has a better house. However, he says that by this time next year, I will have made the most out of the 2 terms, adding that for the remaining months, I will do my best. He told his audience that he had not been to Daura for close to a year due to the demands of his office. He says Northwest had posed more challenges than he expected, while there have been some successes recorded in the Northeast as well as the South. He said, I am eager to go. It's been tough. He says he's grateful to God that people appreciated the personal sacrifices he has made. I wish the person coming after me very best. But he also bared his mind and used the occasion to call on the Academic Staff Union of Nigeria Universities to reconsider their position on their prolonged strike. He declared, enough is enough, and emphasizing that the strike had already taken a toll on the psychology of parents, students, and therefore hoping that by moral issues that they should consider and beg for attention. He said, don't hurt the next generation for goodness sake. Government understands your situation, and government will want the negotiations to continue while students are in lecture halls. The other story that has also come to fore is the recapture of 2 jailbirds who escaped from Kuje recently. The leadership reports that at the Area 1 Motor Park, one escapee from Kuje, whose name was given, was arrested, and when they searched through his baggage, they found 3 wraps of cannabis, and eventually he was identified as one of those who escaped from Kuje prison. He was in fact remanded at Kuje for terrorism and armed robbery charges. A second suspect was also arrested by police of A Division in Suleja. Based on credible intelligence, the police stormed a house, a compound near the hospital, where the 54-year-old fugitive was arrested. And also in Niger State, there is a local government area, Mariga local government area, Niger, where terrorists have been harassing the people. The leadership reports that they have written to the village, Bobi village, and demanding that farmers in the community should pay them 100 million to stop attacks in their community. The terrorists demanded the sum, or else they will invade the area. A sum of 40 million has also been demanded by another village. This time it is Kotonkoro village, also in the same Mariga local government area. Leadership knows that sometimes the bandits demand this ransom. The villagers go to every extent to gather the money and give them, yet they still turn around and come to attack those villages. Meanwhile, Senator Kashim Shettima says that he was visiting children orphaned by Boko Haram when the news of his selection as the running mate to Bola Ahmed Tinubu broke. He has since thanked Bola Ahmed Tinubu for selecting him. He also met the presidential aspirant. There has been mixed reaction about the selection. Bola Ahmed Tinubu says Shettima is the man who can help him bring the best governance to Nigeria, irrespective of religion, state or region. He says that in this day and age, religion, state and ethnicity considerations cannot always fully determine our path to forge ahead as a nation. Therefore, we must move towards development and prosperity. We must be free from these old binds. However, the Anglican Bishop of Calabar, Professor Nneoyi Egbe, says that the APC ticket was an attack on Nigeria's secularity. He emphasized critically that the preponderance of that Muslim ticket is delving into sensitivity. They will perpetuate the kind of government they will perpetuate when they get political power. He says Nigeria is Nigeria is a secular state. However, the constitution recognizes the multi-religious nature of Nigeria. The only clause about religion in the constitution is in section 10 of the constitution, which says the government of the federation or that of a state shall not adopt religion.
Let's shift away from politics very briefly. It's a story that Kieran read on the front page of the Punch newspaper. Sometimes when attention is not focused on these matters, there is a tendency for persons to assume that it's probably normal or its significance is much less so. And that is the compensation for for directors of 10 banks. Kira, you read that story?
Yeah.
And the story is reading that 6.96 billion naira. That is compensation for directors of 10 banks. Now, this is the worry. Executive compensation issues are always matters that you find engaging regulatory authorities, engaging shareholders, engaging particularly the minority shareholders, because the shareholders ultimately are the ones who lose out when you have this kind of humongous compensation for directors of 10 banks. And by the way, these are not just private banks, they are publicly quoted banks that have been, the names of the banks are all there. Union Bank is one of them, Zenith Bank is there, Guarantee Trust is there, Stanbic IBTC, some of the big banks that you think of in the country. So the question then arises, how is it that directors of 10 banks in 1 year earn almost 7 billion naira in this kind of economy? So how much is it that the shareholders themselves also have?
Ideally, the annual general meeting of the board of those banks ought to approve this. And I'm not sure if this went to the shareholders, they will approve such humongous amount.
Well, but of course, the banks have been declaring huge, fortunes in terms of, gains and benefits, annually, and now humongous. So if they get this share, it must have been that they went through the process before it became public. That's what I want to, believe, because they can't just come up with this figure without necessarily following the necessary processes that are required before a particular amount of money will be reached for the 10 banks. But I believe that it's in the public glare. One way or another.
No. Your assumption. I'm sorry.
We have good perspective to
Kira, your assumption.
I'm wondering how this amount could come without the shareholders being privy to it. That's what I'm thinking, because, like Bayo said, they should have meetings.
There ought to be an annual general meeting of shareholders, and the position of directors, their earning and everything ought to be tabled and approved. Was this done?
Assuming it was done. Assuming it was done. Sometimes you need to also witness some of these annual general meetings. Occasionally they turn out to just be the fulfillment of all righteousness. Now, it is not clear. It is not just compensation. It is not just fees for directors. It also includes their allowances. It is not every item of allowance that you would bring to the annual general meeting for approval. I mean, they will spend all kinds of monies. And the reason I'm raising this is that when directors of a company, particularly a publicly quoted company, are not put in check, they can run that business aground. And one of the ways that you can erode the revenue and therefore the financial health of an institution is through this kind of reckless executive compensation.
But let me just read a paragraph here. Reacting, the chairman, Progressive Shareholders Association of Nigeria, Boniface Ukeze, said, although it was important for banks to remunerate their directors properly, there was also the need to ensure this was not done recklessly.
Just take the word out of my mouth.
He said that it is not done. He's not saying it is already done recklessly, but says it is because why am I saying this is that even those who are heading the shareholder association of different banks are not also part of these directors, because of course they are the executive of the shareholders. They meet more regularly, than the normal annual meeting, of the banks.
Well, that's why I raise the issue of sometimes the perfunctory nature of annual general meetings. And Bayo also touched on that. See, the reason I'm raising this is as follows. Where you have institutional shareholders, I will recall that over 10 years ago before 2008, where you had the democratization of shareholding, everybody was buying shares, people had interest in how their shares were performing in these various entities. But some of these shares are some of the shareholders in these entities are institutional shareholders, and then you have to be concerned about what returns those institutional shareholders get to ensure that the business keeps going. It is scandalous, in my opinion, that directors of 10 banks will earn nearly 7 billion naira in this kind of economy. I know you call in the tax authorities, by the way.
Look, yes, Federal Inland Revenue ought to have visited them and find out how much taxes they pay. For instance, Kingsley mentioned some of the banks, including Union Banks. For years, Union Bank has not paid a dime of dividends to its shareholders. But now you are paying directors how many billions?
Now, why are the shareholders not reacting? That's the point. They don't react collectively, right? You know, to drive home the point that these directors are recklessly remunerated, because that's what people will expect to see. If the shareholders are not reacting, then means that it's either that they're also part of it, or that the banks did the right thing.
No, again, with greatest respect, the directors of the banks won't have done the right thing. You're asking a very important question. Why are the shareholders not reacting? The shareholders are many. They are widely dispersed. And then you also have the phenomenon of rational apathy that creeps in where you have widely dispersed shareholders.
And proxy attendance for AGM.
Precisely. Well, and those are the things that sometimes, when directors are not put in check, they take advantage of.
Well, gentlemen, our time is out. These are all part of inadequacies we have in the system, right? So, someone was talking about the National Assembly, for instance, that a senator in Nigeria earns more than U.S. president on monthly and annual basis.
But you are here. A senator represents you. You haven't kicked out your senator representing you for any more than the U.S. president.
Exactly. That's part of what's happening in the system that need to be addressed. At this point, we should just round off with a segment.
Tomorrow, God willing, we should be able to take a look at the ASU issue that the president raised.
All right. So let's take a short break. And when we come back, we'll continue with the program. But for now, let's say thank you to Bayo Altayabi for being part of our show this morning. As always, we'll see you again tomorrow for another segment of newspaper review. You're watching Good Morning Nigeria on NTA Network Service. Stay with us. We'll be back very shortly.
All right, you're still watching Good Morning Nigeria on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. We're having a conversation today on whether it is time to restructure the electricity distribution companies, otherwise known as DISCOs. Let's listen to this background put together by our correspondent, Oyemi Ajayi.
Over the years, the power sector in the country has been faced with a series of challenges, which has consistently put the country in a condition known as epileptic power supply. As part of efforts to bring the sector back on track, the federal government opted for the privatization of the power sector. In 2013, the federal government privatized the electricity sector after raising about $2 billion from the unbundling of the Power Holding Company of Nigeria (PHCN), creating a number of transmission companies, DISCOs for distribution and generation companies. DISCOs, which is referred to electricity distribution companies, is the final stage in the electricity supply chain and also serves as the connection between electricity consumers and the electricity grid. Despite these efforts, the sector, especially the DISCOs, had failed to live up to expectations. Most Nigerians remain without electricity. This brings about the idea of restructuring of 5 of the nation's energy distribution companies. The government had announced that the Port Harcourt, Kano, Kaduna, Ibadan and Benin distribution companies were the affected electricity companies. Part of the conditions for the restructuring includes that qualified private sector investors will buy the bulk of the equity in the company, recapitalize and run them profitably, adding that it will facilitate the activation of emergency funds through the Nigerian Electricity Market Stabilization Facility. The marketers of the Integrated Energy Distribution and Marketing Company said they own 60% shareholding interest in the Ibadan Electricity Distribution Company. It is envisaged that the majority interest in these discos will be sold to competent private sector investors with the requisite technical and financial capacity to recapitalize and manage these entities effectively. However, can we say that the restructuring of these discos is quite apt? Will it translate to effective power supply in the country? These are some questions guests will be answering shortly on NTA's Good Morning Nigeria.
All right, Oyemi, thank you so much there for that report. Now, to discuss the topic, let me first introduce here in the studio Dr. Sam Amadi, Dean of Ave Maria Law School and Director, Abuja School of Social and Political Thought. You're welcome to the program.
Thank you.
All right, Barrister Bode Fadibe is the CEO, Sage Consulting and Communications. It is a pleasure to have you join us this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, Kieran, we might as well just also indicate that Dr. Sam Amadi was chairman of the Electricity Regulatory Commission, that's NEC. That's the supervisory regulatory body of the electricity industry. And Bode Fadipe was most recently the spokesperson for the Abuja Electricity Distribution Company, AEDC. And from our Lagos Network Center, we've been joined again by another energy expert and our regular guest on Good Morning Nigeria, Odion Omofoma. Mr. Omofoma, pleasure to have you again on Good Morning Nigeria.
Thank you very much, and happy to be here. Happy Baka the Salah to all Nigerians.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Also, Baka the Salah to our guest here in the studios.
Gentlemen, you're welcome. Well, you're all familiar, with what is at stake presently. As a matter of fact, why we chose this topic is to see how we can dissect, the necessity, for restructuring the entire energy sector. But of course, our program is focusing on whether it is indeed time to restructure the discourse. And of course, with your pedigree in the energy area, you're qualified to be part of our show this month. So let me begin with Dr. Sam Amadi. Is it really time to begin to think of restructuring the discourse based on inadequacies over the years that Nigerians have witnessed?
Thank you again, Braka de Salah. Okay, so there's some words we use often and then we misuse them. One of the things that happen with language, as George Orwell mentioned years ago, talked about language and politics. He says when we misuse language, then you misuse politics. Because, for example, instead of saying slaughter, you say some people were dispatched to, were sent out of the earth. People will not appreciate what that means. So I like to try to first clarify. This sector is always being restructured. If you ask NEC, they will say that the last tariff order that they issued to help the discos, give back remittances, plug in some money, is part of restructuring. If you ask discos, they will say, yes, restructure this sector. And what they mean is cancel our debt obligations, just wipe up the slate, do some financial engineering that the central bank and others can do, and maybe even the asset acquisition cost that's on them, CBN can just do some financial engineering and they are on zero. Okay, so that's their own concept of restructuring. If you ask the consumer or most Nigerians, they will say restructuring will mean take this thing out from these guys, maybe give it to those who can deliver, or give it to government. So I would like to define, I would say yes, this is time to restructure not just the discourse, not just the players, but go back to the policy. This program started with a Nigerian electric power policy in 2001. People forget there is this policy that triggered that gave back to the Electric Power Sector Reform Act, the roadmap under President Jonathan, and the various initiatives that President Buhari's government has brought in. So what I'm saying is that first, the policy need to be over 25 years of that policy, 2001, 2001, under President Obasanjo. And that policy articulated three broad framework. One is unbundling, which we now know. After unbundling, corporatization and commercialization, and then ultimately to privatization. So the quick question now we have to face is first is, nothing is perfect. There are several errors. I've said before everywhere that the design and the execution of the process was faulty. I think I've been saying that. Not that faulty by intention, deliberately, but because we were even an age then when it was fashionable to say privatize. Government can do nothing. And so many of us took that unbounded rationality that, let's just speed fast to private sector. And in doing that, we compromise several things. Again, not with bad intention, but essentially carried away excitement. Once you sell it. So first, we sold to persons who didn't have. If you look at the case that Blue Disco was making about, we're owing these guys, okay, but we're even in court disputing it. Why should it? It doesn't transition immediately to reacquisition of our asset, or NEC or BPE accepting to hand over the ownership to this company. So they're going to be in court. Now, but what comes out of this is that, look, this is the danger of financializing a problem. If you see it as people getting MOUs and signing some financial papers, but they don't have the capacity on ground. If you look at what we sold, for example, it's based on net positive value. So if you do your proposal very well and show how much you're going to invest, and show that that investment will give you a net present value at the end of 5 years, okay? Then experts will look at it and say, your investment plan and the outcome shows that you're going to be a profitable enterprise. Now, if you don't look at the real capacity, managerial issues, you go with that financial arrangement. But that financial arrangement is speculative, because whether you put 2,000, whether a 2,000 worth of value comes out of it, it's not going to be shown by the spreadsheet. So the point I'm trying to make is that, look, we need to be more thorough and rigorous and say, look, apart from doing this financial engineering, get their books better. In July 1st, there was a tariff review extraordinary tariff review for some of the discos, if not all of them. Now, all those we're doing are interventions to keep the can down the road. But the real problem is, maybe we should have a few people sit back and look at this sector holistically. Not with a view to take out from people and take from B and give A, but to say, look, we made a mistake, there are gaps to be filled. Some of these are technical, some are managerial, some are just simple wrong leadership and policy. We correct it. And not focus so much on the financial, because this notion of financializing every crisis, that you keep putting money, doing mathematics, but the real failure in terms of structural challenges may not be addressed by more money or less money. So I vote for restructuring in a more comprehensive sense, but not necessarily divestment, but restructuring. And maybe I will say more about what has happened later.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Amadi. And let's quickly go over to Odio Mofama in our Lagos network studios. Odio, again, let's have your perspective on what is playing out. The creditors of 5 discos have moved in. We do know now that there is litigation instigated by the Benin disco with regard to the creditors seeking to call in the collateralized shares. Now, some persons have attributed this to the corporate governance failure of the entities and their inability to continue to run those entities as core investors or majority shareholders. So again, I've also indicated that this is a domino effect. Amongst them, AEDC, we saw that earlier, Kano has also fallen, Kaduna has fallen, Port Harcourt has also fallen. Odio, if you are there and you can hear me, that's right. Now we understand that there is satellite issue there. It's in our network center in Lagos. The satellite uplink is acting for. It's not a disco, by the way. So, but let's come back to the studios here and pose the same question to Bode Fadipe. Bode Fadipe, well, I mean, you were in AEDC. AEDC fell to UBA earlier, and now we are seeing what is happening. Ibadan is having issues over receiver manager. Port Harcourt is down. Then if I say down, I mean that the creditors, have moved in and said, look, you guys, ship base. Kano is down. Kaduna is also down. And the next question is, who else is likely to fall?
Who's the next?
Next, yeah.
Quite frankly, it's disturbing that out of 11 discos, 5 of them are down. I mean, starting unfortunately with AEDC that I had the opportunity to work for. So the question I have asked outside of the studio is, how come we waited this long for us to now suddenly realize? Because if you read the statement from the BPE, some very strong words were used. Abysmally bad. For Ibadan, they said Ibadan was the worst performing. Those are very strong words. And you don't become the worst performing overnight. It would have been a consistent record of non-performance over the years of privatization. We are 9 years old in privatization. When did you realize that these companies have become so bad that you have to intervene? In any case, BPE, government is represented on the boards of all the discos by the Bureau of Public Enterprises. For me, if there's anybody that should be sacked, it's BPE. Because we need to find out from them what have they been doing in terms of their responsibilities towards government as representative of government. And for all we care, if 5 have gone down, luckily Yola has been taken over by Mainstream Energy because a force majeure was declared. So I think Yola seemed to have escaped. Enugu has not had any issue, to the best of my knowledge, and indeed no information in the public space about Enugu. Eko and Ikeja seem to be the good boys in the sector. We pray that they continue to remain as the good boys in the sector. And then, of course, those ones that are just too has gone through a reacquisition, so they seem to have escaped that intervention by the banks. But the truth of the matter is that it's quite frightening that 5 of them will come to this extent. And I dare say that the intervention of the financial institutions may not mean the efficiency that we want, because these financial institutions have not come there to bring about efficiency. If anything, they have come there to make sure that the acquisition capital that they gave to the purchasers is not lost. For instance, what government said about Port Harcourt is they use the phrase imminent insolvency. And when a company becomes insolvent, it means that the debt that company is owing, it cannot pay again. Who is going to pay? Now, the money was taken from a particular financial institution. Some people's money was taken from that financial institution. If that financial institution for any reason goes down, those whose money was used for that business are also in trouble. And this could be pensioners. Somebody, it could be a pensioner's money. The money he had worked for about 35 years. Some people have even worked for about 40 years. They have been keeping the money. In the days when I'm unable to do anything again, I will fall back on this. They may not have children that can take care of them, particularly in our own kind of environment. Where do they want to run to? Where do they want to get? So it's quite sad that BP had to wait for this long before they suddenly realize that these companies are not doing well. It's quite sad.
Philip, you actually raised some points. In addition to what Dr. Amadi talked about, he said we'll compromise certain things, or unintentionally, perhaps at the incipient of the unbundling exercise. And he also talking about the fact that, which is very, very pertinent, that government has a representative in all the boards of the discos,
Yes,
across board. So it's very important, and that the BP should also be questioned. These are some of the things coming from
yes,
you. All right. Let's return to Odion or Mopomam. I think put a very good question across to you. I hope you actually captured that, but it all has to do with your perspective to the current situation with the acquisition of the discos by creditors. So let's get your view.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's important to also situate that what is happening to the discos is as a result of how the privatization was structured. It is important to first state that the discos are not owing the banks. It is a core investor who borrowed money to buy the shares, 60% shareholdings in the discos that are now online for the discos, to repay their facilities. So it's important to get that point that the discos aren't owing the banks in the way and manner being put out. Secondly, the acquisition of the discos is pretty much the acquisition of the shareholdings of the core investor. The government still owns 40% of the discos. And restructuring of that facility by the core investors is also imminent, because the reality is that the way privatization was structured of discos, it was structured as a share sale arrangement and not as an asset sale arrangement. What that means is that any repayment of that core investor facility will be from the dividends earned by those shares from the disco, and not direct receivables from the discos. That is the point that I think needs to be emphasized. So where a bank takes over the 60% shareholdings of the disco and decides that the market revenues of that disco it would use to pay the acquisition loan, the bank has flouted something very significant, and it cannot be allowed. Having said that, Bode Fadipe mentioned that the BP perhaps needs to be held accountable for why this has gone on for long. Perhaps so, yes. I think it's good that the BP has finally stepped in, obviously through third-party interventions by the banks, and one wonders why it had to take this long for it to happen. But having said that as well, it is not the end of the problems as we see it, because the discos are now in a far worse situation than they were when we privatized in 2013. You now have a debt of over 3 trillion naira sitting on the balance sheet of discos, and this does not include the acquisition debts that the banks are now foreclosing on the core investors. So clearly a lot needs to be restructured. And the way I see it, there will be improvements. The banks will take ownership of the shares. New investors may come in. But my worry is that how fast can this happen, and what will that do to the corporate governance of some of those discos? Because if you really look at it, beyond the market issues, there was also the issues of corporate governance amongst these discos. And hopefully this time around, part of the restructuring should include proper corporate governance, managerial technical expertise in the discos to make sure that they start to inch towards market profitability, at least a break-even point. But long and short, it's a good it's a good direction. There will be litigations. There will be litigations, but I think it's time that we beat this bullet and stare down at these core investors who have taken over shares of a company and have refused to provide service. Beyond that, we also need to look at the market holistically, as Dr. Sam Amadi had put it. It's not just enough to restructure this, because we need to look at how the structural framework of this market, and I think the structural framework is really wrong. And if we don't address that structural framework, we will just be passing over a dead utility to another investor who would also run it aground.
All right. Thank you very much, Odo. We will return to you in the course of the conversation. I know Dr. Amadi is itching to weigh in on one of the points, but let's get some clarification. The federal government, with its 40% shareholding in each of the discos, was a minority shareholder, if you may. Now, the majority shares were held by 60% of these persons, which those shares have not been called in by the creditors. But very valid issue that Bode raised, namely, and I thought I had also mentioned that in one of our editions of Good Morning Nigeria, when there were always complaints about the performance of the discos. I have asked myself, and I voiced it out on, do these companies, do they hold meetings? And if they held meetings, what were the resolutions? Because there's a public interest factor in the fact that the federal government holds 40% of the shares in these entities. Absolutely. So the question now is, why did it take BPE this long as the representative of the federal government to recognize that, look, even as a minority shareholder, you have rights. I mean, let's not get into too much of company law. If there's minority oppression, you have rights that you can ventilate. But why did it take this long before you don't recognize that something was wrong, and then using what Bode appropriately described as those very strong words in describing Ibadan, in describing some of the other entities? I mean, as it were, these are entities that have literally failed. Dr. Sam.
I think very good question. First, let's, BPE's membership of the board of this disco was controversial. When the assets were privatized, some people had a view that BPE should not be institutionally represented. And the argument was that they are, of course, the undertaker with the Minister of Finance for government assets. But the argument was that if BPE had a monitoring contract, because if you look at the privatization as an exercise is BPE has the authority responsibility to monitor the performance of those agreements. If you're the one who's going to regulate primarily that aspect, that's to see that they follow the contract they signed with the federal government, and then you're on the board. So conflict of interest, people raise the issue. In fact, the particular minister fought hard with BPE, then I think was either Nebo or so, to federal government to appoint corporate persons in the government, public service, engineers, people have experience to represent them, so they're not trapped, so that the BPE can do its job of monitoring. Now, when BPE sets staff at the seat there and they're paid very well and they have allowances, some people can allege all kinds of inducement. So capture of a sort comes in, and that's probably why you don't have that early warning signals and proactive engagement. So that's another issue to resolve. Should we be having BPE, who has a work to do to monitor, also be in the board with the benefits and privileges that comes with? The second issue is, look, there are two levels of this sector. One is, people forget that, see, when government privatize, like you said, is a corporate arrangement. It's change of ownership. It doesn't stop next regulatory work. When I was the chairman, I emphasized separating that two functions, because whether it's public or private, the regulation is still the same. You have to regulate it. So even if government takes back the asset and it becomes NEPA or PHN, it doesn't stop regulation. We will see some sector where government is still, having entities that are still regulated. So the argument here is, if a company has crisis over ownership, like he pointed out, share holding, not asset, because it was clear that none of the assets would be pledged for the financial transaction of the would-be investors. The question we have to ask is two questions. One is, what is the relationship of the regulator? Who monitors part of the filings that you do to regulator, all the financial filings, all the performance filings, the generation, distribution, everything. So the regulator sees everything. The regulator has a stepping right to say, for example, if you're not making returns to the market, if you're not servicing your market obligations, as we have seen that these discos are not returning money, they're not paying their bills upfront, upstream, and all that, the regulator has a right to act irrespective of whether the shareholders are quarreling. So we must first look at regulatory control of this performance, because essentially what the regulator concerns is operational. Are you delivering service? In fact, some companies can be functionally efficient while they are squabbling over ownership. So the fact that people borrowed to purchase a share and have a problem with their banks should not translate literally to failure of service. What should matter to the regulator is whether they are in a financial situation and corporate governance situation to efficiently deliver those services. So, while I want us to not to allow the investors to crowd out and force government to pay them money or help them for their private failings. We should be able to disconnect their financial transactions to acquire an asset and their suffering over it from the corporate performance of the asset as a utility that is regulated. I would say this, that BPE may not be effectively controlling the utilities in terms of monitoring their contract agreement. They agree with the federal government, we're going to reduce losses by X, we're going to make this investment per meter. Their job is to monitor that performance, and together with the regulator, ensure they do that. Now, if you borrow money from your bank, and the bank can acquire back that the ownership rights of that if you fail based on their contract. But should it be a problem that it should only one signal for us that the sector is in distress? The sector is in distress irrespective of the financial issues. For example, any good discourse already mentioned. Maybe because they have a more stable ownership structure, maybe they borrowed money from where their assets, they are performing it very well, but it doesn't mean that any good discourse is actually very efficient in their service delivery. So I want to just draw this distinction between what's happening to asset investors and their shareholding and how they acquire money, and what's happening to the entity, the capacity. And so oftentimes NEC and BP steps in because of these banks and say, look, we want to take over, they're not paying our money. But how about delivering the services the entities as agreements? If they are delivering that efficiently, then this control fight over ownership should be a phenomenon. It shouldn't be a big deal. I'll give you an example. Immediately Abuja Disco cake, after privatization, Abuja had an issue with Copperstone of Zambia and the Nigerian owners. Even for 3-4 years, they were writing to us. We tell them, look, you guys settle your problem. You are investors who are quarreling with yourselves. We are going to be looking at whether these issues affect corporate governance rules, affect performance, affect your financial obligation to market, and affect service delivery to customers. So I think that the regulatory side should be tightened, because even if you acquire these banks have no technical competence in all utilities. They're going to appoint maybe new sets of cronies into the board. As I've seen now, there's nothing that says that this new board is the boards are more technically experienced or capable than those who have misplayed the sector. So what should we have? That's why NEC has the fit and proper regulation we did. Because we know that this partition may likely fail. I would say what we should be concerned as a regulator is to make sure that fit and proper, that the persons who run the entities technically fit, experience-wise, and proper persons, so that at every time you are sure that the management is capable of delivering the industrial obligations, so that we don't run into the problem of assuming that once the bank acquire and put new directors, it's not for them to go back and say, how would this new, in fact, as a matter of fact, the regulator can veto out change of the management and say, because this management is very good, even though you have made acquired, so there should be a transition, a process. The point I'm trying to make, it shouldn't just say because the banks have taken over, or the banks want to take over the asset, or take over the shares and become the owners, therefore their actions should, to override regulatory certainty and performance.
I think what you're saying means that we have a multifaceted kind of challenges within the managerial caucus of these discos, right? And I was going to ask Barrister Bode Fadigbe to also speak to the fact that the government role, what should have been the extent of government role in regulating, or the monitoring rather, of this performance of these discos, considering the fact that, of course, government is represented in their various boards. Because some people also want to believe that there's a level of corruption also in the managerial cadre of this discourse that will have led to this sudden collapse after over 9 years of unbundling of that sector. So what has happened to these 5 discos? Could it be that corruption also played a role in terms of management, of the discourse?
Well, I'm going to be very careful responding to the issue of corruption, because that would deal with facts that you need to present to be able to say, yes, corruption has actually taken place, depending on the perspective from which you really want to look at the word corruption itself, because it's a concept that has diverse interpretations, whether from the academia or whether you are looking at it from the street interpretation. But having said that, I think there is something that we need to be very conscious of. Fantastic analysis by Mr. Mofuma in terms of the share sales agreement or asset sale agreement. Which one did they actually apply in the process of doing this privatization? And what has come out very clearly from his analysis is that it's not asset sale agreement but share sales agreement. But guess what? There is a point that we need to look at very carefully, and I think that was also reflected in the analysis of Dr. Amadi. Now, A pledged his asset. A formed a company and pledged his own shares, and then use that to buy another company. Now, what BP has done in law is that we have called back the asset of A that has that majority shares, and whatever affects A affects everything that A owns. A cannot be a thief and say it is my hand that stole the item and say cut off my hand, without the cutting off of that hand affecting A that is the owner of the hand. This is exactly what has happened in this situation. Now, the second point I want to make in response to that question is this: at the point of privatization, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Amadi, because he was a frontline player in all of this. At the point of privatization, parties got their agreement. For generation, it was that you will ramp up availability. And they went to town, borrowed money to make sure that the machines are running, and then they can provide the energy. For the discos, two fundamental KPIs were listed out. One, that they will reduce their aggregate technical, commercial, and collection losses, which is the biggest elephant in the house. Two, that they will meet our customers. So even if we go on the argument that it is a share sale agreement that we have, what about performance? Right down the road from 2013 till date, there are very few customers in this country that will raise the flag of happiness for any of the discos. I was reading in the media stories about BEDC, where a company said, we have placed a curse on BEDC. It will never succeed because I understand your direction. Coincidentally, it's a Kale people, so it's not even the Benin people. BINI. I mean, NI. It's not our weirdo people. Okay.
A more formal will also in the support of. It's the true one.
But you see, as comedic as that expression could mean, it expressed the deep pain in the hearts of the people that upon privatization, our expectation was that even when that expectation management was poor, because almost all Nigerians felt that from November 1st, it will be 24 hours of power supply, which was an impossibility. Because if you look at some networks in this country, you will weep for this country. Some of the poles that we have is just like what elephant can use as train stick. And you need to reconfigure all of those LT reticulations. You need to reconfigure all of those HT reticulations. Where is the fund going to come from? So if it is on performance alone, ever before now, and I continue to spread that point, BPE ought to have woken up to say, let's do an audit of the network. Show us your capex. Show us your opex. What have you spent the money for? How many injection substations have you built in your network? How long do customers have availability? The issue of graduation of availability is a very recent tariff structure. 16 hours and above, 20 hours and above, 12 hours and all of those things. So on performance alone, if you take all the discos to task, I dare say that perhaps there will be not even one of them that will survive that forensic audit on performance.
Well, but thanks a lot. It's getting more interesting. When you touched on some interesting aspect for the members of our viewing audience. I mean, not everyone can grasp the theoretical foundations around the subject matter. Not everyone can also understand some of the legal issues or corporate governance issues. And the reason why we are discussing this, you may say that, oh, we are flying, say, at 35,000 feet. Now, let's bring it down to 3,000 feet so you will understand better before I go to Odio and Mofama. If you listen carefully to what our guests are indicating this morning, it is that the entities, that's to say the discos, whether AEDC where we are in Abuja, or whether Kano in BDC where he said a cost was placed on them, or whether Kano or Port Harcourt or Ibadan, where those companies are not performing well, the consequences are what you and I will feel at the end of the day as customers. You are looking for meters, you cannot get meters. You are looking for regular supply of electricity, you cannot get. They will give you estimated billing. They will come with their ladders and disconnect you. You will go and buy credit for electricity, you will be buying darkness. These are some of the things because of the major problems that are above there, either in terms of their ownership structure, the management of their ownership structure, and so on and so forth. Now back to Odio Mofama in our Lagos Network Center. Odio, well, as part of what is playing out, the central bank it's been urged to say, look, you are the regulator, because there are many, but there are at least now multiple regulatory agencies that are involved in all of this. The banks have moved in, and then of course NEC itself is also there to say, look, what is it as a bank or as a creditor you are allowed to do in the electricity industry. The central bank, which is the regulator of the banking sector, is also being told, look, don't allow these creditors to hold on to these shares in perpetuity, otherwise you will asphyxiate the matter. The bottom line, as you gentlemen have said, is that this is not so much about financialization, even though that is the key interest of the banks, but the technical aspects and ensuring that there is, if you may, a corporate re-engineering that will enable this discourse perform better. Explain this further to our audience.
Well, I would say that, first of all, the banks taking over the shareholdings of some of those discos and invariably the management of the discos may be positive to them, but it still wouldn't change some of the fundamental issues in the sector, right? So let's break it down. There's a failure at the corporate governance side of things. BP is on the board, the co-investor is on the board of the disco, right? And they should have regulated corporate actions. In other words, what's the investment that the co-investor is bringing to the disco? What's the investment the federal government or the BP is bringing to the discos to improve a dilapidated network? On the sector regulation side, there was a failure of the regulator to also regulate the license that it gave the discos to operate, right? And that was all because of the way and manner the expectations of privatization were built. For instance, co-investors were given a 5-year window to inject capital into the business and then reduce the aggregate technical collection and commercial losses over a 5-year period, and also meter customers. But what was missing was the fact that the capex requirements, in other words, the capital expenditure, the investment that they ought to bring into the disco, first of all, was extremely limited. It was completely unrealistic, number one. And then number two, the time frame to recover that investment was even too short. A very good example, I was part of the privatization process, and I consulted for one of the co-investors who had submitted a privatization bid. In that privatization bid, the co-investors said they were going to spend 228 billion naira over 5 years to improve that disco. Dr. Amadi would have a recollection of this. And the regulator under Samamadi, Dr. Amadi, said, look, you can't spend 228 billion. How are you going to recover 228 billion over 5 years? And that was the grounds that they were going to cross out that co-investor. it turns out that what eventually what NERC was looking at was the total investment, capital investment for ATCRC reduction and providing meters over 5 years was 22 billion naira, about 24 billion naira over 5 years. Now, anybody in his right mind would realize that 25 billion naira would not even suffice in closing out the metering gap in 1 year. So it was completely unrealistic that investors were asked to inject that amount of capital, which was grossly inadequate, number one, to improve it, and then the timeline to recover it was too short. 5 years it was too short. So you've come up with this situation where it will not have worked. On the regulatory side, the regulator could have anticipated some of these problems, but unfortunately the regulator at the time that this happened didn't have significant powers to yank up the licenses or take these actions. It is only now that NERC has put in place a business continuity plan that is now trying to act, but unfortunately the horse has bolted out of the stable. So NERC has to now have a back foot to try and see how they can curb this. But the person to blame here was the BP, who should have even asked the core investors, look, this 22 billion that you said you were going to bring over 5 years, how much are you bringing? Have you brought it? You were supposed to have reduced X, Y, Z. Have you done it? In line with the performance agreement. The BP was also supposed to prod government to say, government, you were supposed to do X, Y, Z for these investors to recover these monies that they are bringing in. Have you also done it? None of this was done. So we're back. We are now where we are today, where we have a failed distribution sector. Unfortunately, I don't see a way out. The discos are down, are literally down, and are swimming in debt. Significant debt that it will take years, decades to recover. And any investor that jumps in would only have a sinking horse to ride, or a dead horse to ride, unfortunately, and we have to jump out as well. So I would say that, look, the CBN's pumping money into the sector is not the solution. Unfortunately, has worsened the financial stability of the sector as a whole, because you've created too much debt that the market cannot repay, right? So at some point, they have to figure out a way to restructure the repayment obligations of discos. Now, I'm not talking of core investors, discos, and that would take years, right? That would also block investments, new investments in the sector, because the CBN ranks as number one and number two in the cash flow of the sector. It's very odd that the central bank is now at the top of the cash flow waterfall of the sector, and that in any market doesn't bode well, because that would mean that the CBN would need to first recover all that money before any investor will recover any investment they put in the disco. So I think we need to look at this holistically again and figure out a way how to make the discos more commercially viable, and that would mean disaggregating the size of the discos. They're just too big. Maybe that's the first way to look at it. Corporatization of the business units, like for instance, Asokoro distribution unit, perhaps is much more profitable than Abuja Disco as a whole entity. Those kind of structures should now be looked at so that we can start to have some viability and commercial profitability of some of these units within the discos.
Okay, well, we are seeing a situation where money cannot solve a problem. Because from what he said, that even if you inject one amount of funds in this subsector, that it will not certainly change the course of history of power distribution in Nigeria. Well, from what he said, so that they are swimming in debt. It's about 258 billion naira that this was lost in 11 months from one research. 258 billion naira lost in 11 months. You know, I raised an earlier question concerning corruption in the practice, because from all indications, what you have all told us clearly indicates that perhaps there are inadequacies, intentionally or unintentionally. But what played out after all said and done is the failure of this discourse, the gradual failure. We have 5 now, and of course maybe 6 to go. Nobody is praying for that, but that is the direction that things are going. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, Dr. Amadi will be, responding to some of the issues raised by Omofan, and we also like him to also talk about the issue of corruption in the system, which may have led to some parts of the failures that we are talking about with respect to the discourse in Nigeria. We'll take a short break now. When we come back, the conversation will definitely continue. Okay. All right, you are welcome back. Of course, we're having a conversation with respect to the topic that we are dissecting this morning. As a matter of fact, we're going to Dr. Amadi. Mr. Omopoman raised a number of issues, very, very critical issues, which of course I'm sure you have noted and to refer to. But one aspect that I'd like to raise here is the issue of the inability of NEC to carry out its responsibility with respect to proper and adequate regulation of the discourse. And again, the BPE is also a failure to ensure that the discourse, there's a proactive action, to ensure that discourse did not fall to the level where they found themselves at this moment. That, and of course, the other things you want to talk about.
Okay, thank you. I think a very interesting and good point that he made earlier on. The problem of he talked about inadequate capex provision. Okay, so you say spent 25 billion allowed.
I'm sorry to interject, Kieran. I mean, we said this capex.
Okay,
so that for our viewers, somebody say capex. Are you referring to a carpenter or something? That we know that it's capital expenditure. It makes sense. It makes sense. Just for personal expenditure.
Okay, so
capex, not just carpenter.
Expenditure in a disco has the capital, and of course the operational maintenance and other expenditure. And the capital expenditure, capex we call it, it tells you the kind of investment they can make. Things that have some costs, that have fixed, costs that last for a long time. So the transformers, they're talking about substations and all that. Now, when the point with privatization that I noted many years ago, even in my book in 2009, is that it usually becomes a guesswork around finance. So what we did was, if you look at tariff, 5 years, okay, you're going to make investment in 5 years. So there's something that in 5 years you will recover X the amount. Now, if it now says this capex or this capital expenditure will be recovered through tariff for that 5 years period, it means that the tariff will boom. So you have to now regulate and say the most you can financially invest within this period that is allowable and recoverable is X. But that's the problem. Investment in the sector should be long-timed usually. So that's why later we did a 15-year tariff part when I was there. The idea is you have to borrow long-term money. You can't borrow short-term money and want to recover it through tariff. So that means tariff will be like 180,000 naira or 180 per kilowatt hour. Unaffordable. In fact, there was a tariff we did before I left, which was controversial, which I reversed, which Enugu Disco, for example, we had 180% increase of tariff at a time for manufacturers. The meaning of that was that every manufacturing industry in the southeast, in Enugu particularly, in Enugu Disco area, southeast, will move away because that basically, and there was so much petition. So the idea is that these people needed their own asset. That was how we were designed, that they will come with $100 million to acquire the assets. Then you borrow to finance recovery and improvement. But most of them, if not all of them, acquired with 100% loan. So if you now benchmark their loan to the asset value or to the share value of their companies, they don't have capacity to borrow anymore. Now, two things that we have done. In many countries, you sell it for zero. Okay, zero it out. So notional $1. Okay, but now you pin them down to executable contracts. The money is there. This is the money, and from this to this, you put this money, put this in the sector. Military, for example, maybe have been profitable. And again, I objected. I told the minister then, but like that, this is the most expensive profitable in the world. When we are paying off labor. We all this money went to labor and corruption. The EFCC arrested a couple of, or we are working with a couple of officers, then BPE, allegation of embezzling those funds. Okay, so you created a slush fund, sold the assets for fee, use that money to pay disco employers who remain in the employment. You are there. So most of the guys you inherited, you kept many of them because you're not going to meet people from heaven. They were there. They are paid off. Those who are on contract were given 50%, have to increase them before they paid off. So this money that we collected from the investors, which they borrowed from the banks, Nigerian banks mostly, were used to pay off and to steal. Then you don't have money to finance the investment that you need to improve the network, to generate value to customer and to yourself, and increase capacity to receive more power as you have now, and therefore sell more, make more revenue. So the point therefore is the way it was designed. And again, many of these discos also had investors who had MOU. They had no clear contract. There was a mismatch between their asset base and their shareholding. So if Sam Ahmad and Co goes to Kilian and Co in North Korea or South Korea, okay? South Korea or Malaysia, and we agree, you say, okay, 5% share you're going to have. But I use your 20 billion asset base to tie to my own 20 million. And then we pass the $100 million threshold. You're not going to bring any money. That 70 million that is that I used to mark up is not going to come to the sector. At most, you have 5% what you have, okay, share. But you have 5% share, but 80% balance sheet. See the mismatch. So there are mismatch everywhere because we are, like I said, we wanted to privatize because we are tired of government. Now, in retrospect, that's why I argued. I know I had a big issue with the ministry and everybody in the sector. They thought I was against privatization. But my point was that it's difficult to do well. And if you look at countries where it has worked, you face it. Then regulation grows with it. Capacity goes with it. Corporate rules. For example, even the banks. We're talking about the banks this morning. You guys talking about the banks. If you don't have a strong corporate governance and regulation, private sectors will collapse. The reason why private sector does well is because they are constrained by rules. And the shareholders oftentimes are more interventionists. But in the public sector, it's also about changing of ownership. It's also about increasing corporate governance, improving regulatory management of that sector. So what we did was that we were too carried away by the private sector. And again, let's not forget, we don't have a good private sector. We don't have a private sector that has the capacity to finance in the long term, 20 years, 30 years, and then gradually, if hard, they will just meet out their customers and take the money. And they know that it will help them conserve their revenue, and in the next 10, 20, 15 years, they improve. So the point here is, so all it tells us is that, look, we hurriedly privatized. And it's funny to me that the only investor who was totally discredited was Emekofo's group in Enugu because of probably people didn't trust their business. But they ended up being the ones now probably standing in terms of takeover. So that tells that there's also a mismatch between these financial papers we're banding around and the real traction that investors have in real management.
You have just spoken on the issue of NEC not really intervening.
No, I was trying to avoid it. I'm joking.
At the former NEC board, you understand the game.
Let me tell you what happened to NEC. I think, you see, regulation, it has a microeconomy, meaning that as a regulator, I was fighting with the ministry all the time. You know that very well. So I was seen as a bad person because I wanted NEC to be independent. Now, when that regime is finished, you have to look at the political economy in which every regulator works. It's very important. You can't go too out if they don't have that kind of reinforcement. So for NEC, I think what they're doing is that NEC, in terms of technical regulation, they are doing well. If you look at their orders. But what probably they need to improve is that sense of striking out themselves and moving on their own to take more control of the sector. You see, my point when I was there, I reckon myself as the owner of the sector. So just like the central bank governor sees himself as the owner of the finance sector, what that means to me is that if I see crisis, we'll go after it. But people have different style, and the present leadership might be much more, deferring to political authorities. And oftentimes, people say NEC has been compromised. Now, I don't think it's financial compromise, but NEC is still a very strong institution in terms of integrity. All of you attest. But what I see missing there is a narrative of what's going on. If you see what's going on as corruption. Let's stamp our feet. You act differently. If you see it as maybe some technical problems, then you work only on the technical side. So I think they should see this as both technical and political. The sense that they should not just think that better rules, more tariff will solve the problem. You probably need to take some people out. You probably need to try to, for example, 6 months after the pandemic, we did a snap audit. Like, I will discover that Abuja, Ibadan, a few companies, we are overspending. If you look at their approved spend, what they should spend, they are spending so much on their directors, renting house in Asokoro. And we find them, we find some of them was something million. So we form back, this money collect back. Because there's a procurement guideline. This every regulated sector means that you can't spend within the procurement guideline. Number one, competitive procurement of everything. Number two is that they send their financial return. NEC supposed to be looking at their finances and say, look, how much are they spending on service delivery component? How much are they spending on the administrative side of it? Because if NEC does not, and that's why NEC has MCR, they have an accounting, a market oversight surveillance department, whose job is, because they receive this report. So the question is, are they willing to step out and conduct the audit and say, look, we hold this CEO responsible. I will ask that they should return X amount of money. Because what happened all over the world is that regulated entities like to rig the system. They pay themselves more, they spend more on themselves, they spend less on their obligation to the market, except somebody is enforcing it. So you need to be much more aggressive with private entities than even with public entities.
Exactly.
In regulation.
Thanks, Dr. Amaniki. You remember when we were discussing the compensation and allowances for directors of 10 banks worth almost 3 billion naira. 10 banks directors earning 3 billion.
6.9 billion.
No, that's 2.96 billion. 6.9 billion. Yes, 6.9. Sorry. Let me get my head around that figure again.
Shock.
Because it's shocking. I mean, to imagine that, and it's just going away, and we're all in the same economy.
Each of them will get having about 700 million.
That's right. And what we are saying that some of the allowances will include diesel allowance, generator allowance, holiday allowance, gardener allowance, and they will not pay that gardener 1/100th of the money that is there in the books. But thanks, Dr. Amadi, for raising this issue. But we're getting pressed for time. I wanted to throw up two issues, but I'll take it one after the other. The franchise areas of some of the discos are said to be large. Omofoma mentioned that, look, in terms of efficiency, if you had a Sokoro, for instance, as a unit, probably excised out of the franchise area, it might be more efficient. When you look at the states covered by some of these entities, they look so large that inefficiency was almost a factor that will creep in. Will breaking down the franchise areas and then, of course, getting some other persons help, in the efficiency of the discourse that, well, Amafama has already described as a failed distribution sector.
That expression failed was first of all dropped from the mouth of Dr. Amadi, and I was hearing it for the first time from you, and I felt very excited because I remember very clearly that Dr. Ogaji came here and said we are flogging a dead horse. So again, it reinforces the fact that this sector requires more than an urgent intervention. If there's going to be any intervention, it should be like yesterday. Now, in terms of size, I dare say that it may be speculative to say size is an issue that if you attack it, it will bring about efficiency. Admittedly, smaller units are easier to manage, but it will depend on the managerial capacity of the manager. What is his efficiency level? I refrain from talking about corruption for deliberate reasons. Somebody out there could say, oh, maybe this is as a result of buy. No. But the truth of the matter is this. Look at most of the discos except Lagos, except Eko and Ikeja that are domiciled within a state. Most of them, if not all of them, have at least 3 states under them. But let's take Abuja, for instance. Abuja has the federal capital itself, which is a equivalent of a state, and then you have Nasarawa, you have Niger, and then you have Kogi State. Niger State alone is bigger than the entire southeast put together. But the question is this: what is the electricity penetration of Niger State? Is it the whole of Niger State that is electrified today, such that you will say that because of that large area, it has become too humongous for the disco to manage? So for me, I question the reasoning behind breaking it down to smaller units for easy management. But it also makes a lot of sense, because marketers in the discos, for instance, will tell you that I have too many customers to deal with, such that I can only deal with some of them for about 1 or 2 weeks before the billing cycle commences, and extrapolate for the others, which is where estimated billing comes in. But if I have just 10 customers to deal with, I can go to them house to house and bill them. I can even attend their social engagements and interact with them in such a way that we become family members, and even without going to their homes, I can call them, Epa, your bill is it's time for you to pay. That personal relationship will be there. So from that perspective, breaking it down, making it smaller units will make a lot of sense, because again, one of the major problems that we are suffering at the national level is that we have a common transmission, the grid, so that when something happens in Sokoto, it's affecting the man in Ikorabasi. But if we regionalize the grid, for instance, and say southwest grid, south grid, sorry, I'm going into transmission, but I'm just using it to analyze the issue of breaking down to smaller units, so that the smaller they are, the more manageable they become. But again, the regulator has to stand up. Dr. Amadi has been very fantastic dealing with his old constituency, even though it's a slap on the wrist. But the fact remains that the regulator, both regulators, both BPE and the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, must also be courageous enough to detach itself from that political that political chain, perhaps tied around its legs, such that it's now becoming difficult for it to move as much as it ought to move. So I agree with you in the terms of breaking it down to smaller unit, but that does not mean that there will be no problem again. Yes, it probably certainly will.
At least we reduce the problem to the barest minimum.
Yes,
that can happen.
Yes.
All right. Time is not on our side, but I'd like you to quickly take a look at this. Now, what should be the implications, of the current takeover of the 5 discos by banks? Because you have already pointed out that it's not going to be easy for these banks to actually operate the system, because they need to also deal with the professionals who perhaps maybe those who are there, ever before the collapse of the discos. What are we expecting from the banks, and how do we be able to manage the discos for continuous supply of power to the areas of their franchise?
All right. First of all, let me say the takeover of the shares and then of the discos and management of the discos by the banks should not result in deterioration of services. As a matter of fact, I expect to see a very slight improvement, and in reality there's been some slight improvement in the disco that I live in, because I expect that the slack managers will now wake up with the realization that there's a new sheriff in town. The second is that we would see increased litigation in the sector, because 2 shareholders have gone to court or are in court already. We might likely see more take on the BP and NEC with regards to this order. But more importantly, it signifies a change in paradigm in the sector, that we now have a BP and a NEC that is ready to step in. Perhaps they may not have all the legal instruments in their favor. For instance, if you look at the Electric Power Sector Reform Act, it doesn't really empower NEC to move in the way and manner it has moved in. NERC has had to supplement by making certain orders and hoping to enforce some of these orders. But those things can still be challenged in court, as we all know it. And the discos or some of the core investors are challenging those that structure. But what it would then also do is also to start to prepare investors, new set of investors to come into the sector. I have been approached by a number of investors who say, look, we're interested in 1 or 2 discos. Can you please help us put together certain things? But the reality is that if you look at the balance sheet of the discos, they would also struggle to bring in new investors into the market. But in any case, we expect and anticipate that will work. Lastly, we now hope that the BPO would sit up on its responsibilities to monitor the corporate affairs, corporate governance of discos. Take, for instance, no disco has produced audited financial statements for the last 9 years. You cannot be a 40% shareholder and there is no audited financial statement, because that is what you know, that is what you use to assess the performance of a company. Forget about the sector regulation now. Let's look at it from a corporate perspective. There is no way the shareholders of UBA will tolerate the management and their board if they do not have an audited financial statement for the last 1 year. There's no way that even SEC would allow it. So I think this action will start to translate into certain firm actions by both NERC and the BP, who sits on the board of this discos and who also has the responsibility to enforce the performance agreement or whatever agreement they reach with the discos. Lastly, the CBN is preparing some further intervention into the sector, so perhaps this action will help the CBN decide whether it wants to go ahead with such interventions or perhaps it needs to pause and then allow the market heal itself. In other words, let the core investors sort themselves out their issues with BP and their banks, and let the sector regulator also decide on the best way and manner which new funds and new interventions will come into the sector. It's positive, but at the same time too, one has to be careful how we manage the process.
All right, Odion Mofama, thank you very much. Gentlemen, we always get pressed for time when you have brilliant and experienced guests on a very interesting subject matter. We don't have enough time to proceed. I was just wondering, gentlemen, let me throw this in. All the interventions by the central bank, we heard of hundreds of billions of naira, sometimes amounting to trillion. I wouldn't know, sometimes the stories are not very clear in the papers when you read them. Were those money just thrown in? Or if those monies were thrown in, could they at some point now be converted to equity? And if so, on whose behalf? Well, that's a matter that I'm sure the financial experts will take a look at. On that note, we'd like to thank all our 3 guests with us this morning. Dr. Sam Amadi, former chairman of the Electricity Regulatory Commission and now dean of the Faculty of Law at Ave Maria University in Nasarawa State. Dr. Sam Amadi, delight having you on the program.
Thank you.
We also would like to appreciate Barrister Bode Fadipe, former spokesman of the Abuja Electricity Distribution Company and now CEO of Sage Consulting and Communications. Bode, always a delight having you on Good Morning Nigeria.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
And from our Lagos Network Center, Odion Mofama, an energy expert, passionate about the industry and very well informed himself. Odion, great delight having you this morning again.
All right, and that's where we draw the curtain on this edition of Good Morning Nigeria. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you again tomorrow. We'll bring you a fresh package of the program. My name is Kirian. Have a good holiday.
And I'm Kingsley Osadolo, joining Kirian to say, continue to enjoy your holiday, but remember, work resumes tomorrow. I'll be right back here sometime 7 o'clock in the morning.